From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Tomorrow, the Supreme Court will hear arguments about whether Title VII, which bans discrimination on the basis of sex, applies to the LGBTQ community. If we lose, that's a loss for everyone. Your employer could fire you because you're not the kind of man or woman he thinks you should be.
As the Supreme Court prepares to hear arguments in a major case on LGBTQ workplace discrimination, we speak to two leading trans rights advocates, the actress Laverne Cox and the attorney Chase Strangio. Then to the Middle East, where the U.S. has begun withdrawing from northeast Syria as Turkey prepares to invade Kurdish-controlled areas.
Regarding this matter, after our talk in the evening on this issue, the withdrawal has started, as President Trump stated. Now, counterparts are carrying out their work and will continue to do so.
The surprise announcement came after a phone call between Turkey and President Trump. We'll speak to longtime Middle East correspondent Patrick Coburn of The Independent. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The White House said Sunday it'll end support for Kurdish forces in northeastern Syria and has ordered U.S. troops to step aside while Turkey begins a massive air and ground operation. The U.S. has about 1,000 troops in northeastern Syria. It's not clear whether they'll pull back just to allow Turkey's assault or leave Syria entirely. Since 2014, the U.S. has backed the Syrian Democratic Forces led by the Kurdish People's Protection Units, or YPG, in their fight against ISIS. A spokesperson for the fighters called Trump's decision a shocking and unexpected betrayal. On Sunday, the White House said President Trump made the decision after speaking by telephone with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This comes as mass anti-government protests are continuing in Iraq. The death toll has now topped 109 as police and soldiers continue to open fire on thousands of demonstrators defying government-imposed curfews. Later in the broadcast, we'll speak with Middle East correspondent for The Independent, Patrick Coburn. A second whistleblower has stepped forward to accuse President Trump of abusing his powers by soliciting help from Ukraine's government in order to discredit the president's campaign rival, Joe Biden, and his son. Lawyers for the first whistleblower confirmed a new whistleblower with first-hand knowledge of Trump's interactions with Ukraine has corroborated the initial complaint in an interview with the intelligence community's Inspector General. The growing scandal has spawned an impeachment inquiry by House Democrats. This comes as top Trump administration officials continue efforts to stonewall the investigation. On Friday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo missed a deadline to comply with a House subpoena to produce documents related to the impeachment inquiry. During a public event in Athens, Greece on Saturday, Secretary of State Pompeo admitted he was listening in on the now infamous July 25th phone call between President Trump and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. But he called the impeachment inquiry a silly gotcha game.
When the world doesn't focus on the things that are right, the things that matter, the things that impact real people's lives, and instead you get caught up in some silly gotcha game, you see, that's not healthy. That doesn't help democracies flourish. It doesn't help grow economies.
At least 3 Republican senators have broken ranks to criticize President Trump. Nebraska's Senator Ben Sasse, Utah Senator Mitt Romney, and Maine Senator Susan Collins. Senator Romney Friday tweeted Trump's behavior was wrong and appalling. He added, quote, "When the only American citizen President Trump singles out for China's investigation is his political opponent in the midst of the Democratic nomination process, it strains credulity to suggest that it is anything other than politically motivated," Romney said. Trump fired back on Twitter, calling for Romney's impeachment, calling him pompous and, quote, "a fool who's playing right into the hands of the do-nothing Democrats," Trump tweeted. North Korean officials have called off talks with the U.S. on denuclearization, warning the Trump administration it has until the end of the year to change its bargaining approach if it wants negotiations to continue. On Saturday, North Korea's chief nuclear negotiator denied the U.S. State Department's rosy assessment of the talks in Stockholm, Sweden, saying U.S. negotiators brought nothing to the table.
미국은 그동안 유연한 접근과 새로운 방법
The U.S. raised expectations by offering suggestions like flexible approach, new methods, and creative solutions. But they have disappointed us greatly and dampened our enthusiasm for negotiations by bringing nothing to the table.
U.S. peace envoy Zalmay Khalilzad met with the Afghan Taliban in Pakistan Friday for the first time since President Trump publicly called off talks last month aimed at ending the longest war in U.S. history. The informal talks in Islamabad came after the Taliban took credit for a series of deadly attacks that disrupted September's presidential election, which saw less than a quarter of eligible voters cast ballots. The renewed peace talks do not include members of the Kabul-based Afghan government. In the Gaza Strip, a 28-year-old Palestinian man was killed and 40 people wounded Friday after Israeli troops opened fire on weekly protests near the besieged territory's separation barrier with Israel. A spokesperson for Gaza's health ministry said 22 people were shot with live bullets. The latest killing brought the number of Palestinian protesters killed in Gaza to 313 since protests began in March of 2018 under the banner of the Great March of Return. In Washington, D.C., women's rights activists rallied outside the Supreme Court Sunday to call for Justice Brett Kavanaugh's removal from the bench 1 year after Republican senators narrowly confirmed him to the Supreme Court despite multiple credible accusations of attempted rape and sexual assault. Boston Congressmember Ayanna Pressley introduced a resolution last month to impeach Justice Kavanaugh. She told the crowd she believed Kavanaugh's accusers and Anita Hill, who told Congress in 1991 that Justice Clarence Thomas sexually harassed her.
I still believe Anita Hill. I still believe Dr. Christine Ford. And I believe Deborah Ramirez.
The weekend rally at the Supreme Court came after justices announced Friday they'll weigh the constitutionality of Louisiana's anti-choice legislation, which requires any doctor performing an abortion to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. Pro-choice groups call such statutes trap laws or targeted regulation of abortion providers. They say the Louisiana law would leave the state with just a single doctor legally allowed to perform abortions. Meanwhile, the court is set to hear arguments Tuesday in 3 cases to determine whether LGBTQ people can be fired from their jobs due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. After headlines, we'll have more on what's been described as the most important case directly addressing LGBTQ people ever to reach the United States Supreme Court. In Hong Kong, tens of thousands of protesters defied a ban on face masks Saturday and marched through a pouring rainstorm as the prohibition took effect. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam ordered the ban as part of a widening crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrations that erupted last spring.
Carrie Lam is trying to use the ban to keep us from coming out. I want to tell her that this is counterproductive. She's just targeting the symptoms, but not the root causes. She's suppressing our right to express ourselves, and this will only push us further.
Police declared the assembly unlawful, firing tear gas and charging with batons. Some demonstrators responded by throwing bricks and gasoline bombs. In climate news, scores of people have been arrested in civil disobedience actions as the group Extinction Rebellion kicked off 2 weeks of protests in 60 cities around the globe demanding urgent action on the climate crisis. In Sydney, Australia, police arrested 30 people who blocked a major road. There were similar scenes in Melbourne and in Wellington, New Zealand, where activists surrounded a government building that grants permits for oil and gas drilling. In the Netherlands, 50 people were arrested after they erected erected a tent to block a road in central Amsterdam. In London, police arrested at least 20 people Monday as protesters have vowed to close down Parliament and Trafalgar Square. This is Lizzie Mansfield, one of the protesters.
We're here because the government's not doing enough on the climate emergency. And the key word is emergency, right? They declared an emergency after the rebellion in April. And then we've seen surprisingly little action. So we're here to really push home this is an emergency. You know, we only get one planet. And so we're here to try and defend it.
On Saturday, London police used a battering ram to break into a building used by Extinction Rebellion, seizing protest supplies and arresting 10 people on preemptive charges of suspicion of conspiracy to cause a public nuisance. Back in the United States, the Trump administration moved Friday to open more than 720,000 acres of California land to oil and gas drilling. Environmentalists have vowed to sue to block what would be the first federal fossil fuel lease sales since 2013. Claire Lakewood, senior attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity, said, quote, turning over these spectacular wild places to dirty drilling and fracking will sicken Californians, harm endangered species, and fuel climate chaos. President Trump signed a proclamation Friday that'll deny visas to immigrants who can't afford to purchase health insurance within 30 days of their arrival to the United States. Under Trump's plan, which is set to take place on November 3rd, immigrants will also be shut out from subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. In response, the immigrant advocacy group United We Dream tweeted, our health care system is shot, and the Trump administration knows this. This is another economic and racist attack on a community who deserves health care in the first place. In Tucson, Arizona, a pretrial hearing is scheduled today for senior Border Patrol agent Gus Zamora, who's accused of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a junior agent last May. Zamora's pleaded not guilty to charges he pressured a female subordinate to drink to excess before leading her back to his hotel room and assaulting her. Senior officials at Customs and Border Patrol allowed Zamora to retire after his arrest and indictment. One of the women who accused deceased serial sexual predator Jeffrey Epstein of attacking her told The Washington Post she holds billionaire Leslie Wexner, the chair and CEO of Victoria's Secret parent company, responsible for what happened to her. Maria Farmer says she was staying at one of Wexner's properties in Ohio in the summer of 1996 when Epstein and his associate Ghislaine Maxwell sexually assaulted her. Farmer was employed by Epstein at the time. She says when she tried to leave the house, Wexner's security guards wouldn't let her. Farmer first detailed her attack in an affidavit she submitted earlier this year as part of an Epstein-related lawsuit. But her interviews with The Washington Post are the first time she's publicly spoken about Leslie Wexner and his connection to Epstein. In Dallas, Texas, a key witness in the murder trial of former Dallas police officer Amber Geiger was shot to death outside his apartment Friday. Joshua Brown lived across the hall from Botham Jean, the 26-year-old black accountant who was shot and killed in 2018 inside his own apartment by Officer Geiger, a white woman who was off duty at the time. During the trial, Brown gave emotional testimony about hearing gunshots the night of Jean's murder. Officials have not yet identified a suspect in Brown's murder. Attorney Lee Merritt, who represented the Jean family in the trial, wrote in social media Brown's testimony played a key role in challenging Geiger's account of the incident and claims she had shouted commands at Botham before shooting him. A court in last week sentenced Geiger to 10 years in prison for shooting and killing Botham Jean. She faced up to 99 years in prison. Bernie Sanders' campaign says the Vermont senator, 2020 presidential hopeful, suffered a heart attack last Tuesday after experiencing chest pains during a campaign event in Las Vegas. Sanders had 2 stents inserted to clear a blocked artery. He left an area hospital after a 2.5-day stay before returning home to Burlington, Vermont, with his wife, Jane.
Hello, everybody. We're in Las Vegas. I just got out of the hospital a few hours ago, and I'm feeling so much better. I just want to thank all of you for the love and warm wishes that you sent to me. See you soon on the campaign trail.
And And in New York City, 4 people were killed and a 5th badly injured early Saturday after a man with a metal bar attacked homeless people as they slept on the sidewalks of Lower Manhattan's Chinatown. Police arrested 24-year-old Randy Santos and charged him with the murder. Santos is reportedly also homeless and has struggled with addiction. The Coalition for the Homeless warns in recent years, homelessness in New York City has reached the highest level since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Supreme Court is starting a new term today in Washington, D.C. The court will be hearing major cases this year involving reproductive rights, immigration, the Second Amendment, and LGBTQ rights. On Tuesday, the court will hear arguments in 3 cases to determine whether LGBTQ people can be fired from their jobs due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. It's been described as, quote, the most important case directly addressing LGBTQ people ever to reach the United States Supreme Court. Under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, employers cannot discriminate against employees on the basis of sex as well as race, color, national origin, and religion. But the Trump administration claims the law does not cover discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. One of the cases centers on a transgender woman from Michigan named Amy Stevens, who was fired from her job at a funeral home in 2013.
When I was fired, it made me mad, to say the least. I was hurt that I was being treated that way after the commitment and service that I had been providing. And that's when it finally hit home that we weren't treated the same as everybody else. And that it was time that somebody stood up and said enough is enough.
The cases mark the first time the Supreme Court will rule on LGBTQ rights since conservative Justice Brett Kavanaugh replaced Anthony Kennedy, who had written many of the court's major LGBTQ rights rulings. We're joined right now by 2 guests. Laverne Cox is with us, award-winning transgender actress, longtime trans rights activist, best known for her role of Sophia Brissett on the show Orange is the New Black. In 2014, she became the first transgender person on the cover of Time magazine and the first openly transgender person to be nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award in an acting category. We're also joined by Chase Strangio, Deputy Director for Transgender Justice with the ACLU's LGBT and HIV Project. His work includes impact litigation as well as legislative and administrative advocacy on behalf of LGBTQ people and people living with HIV across the United States. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Tuesday is a very significant day in the Supreme Court. Laverne Cox, talk about the cases that are before the High Court.
Well, it's the first time the Supreme Court will hear any case involving transgender rights, transgender civil rights, with Amy Stevens' case. And there's 2 other cases of where 2 gay men were also fired from their jobs simply for being who they are. This is the first time the court will hear cases about whether or not Title VII applies to the LGBTQ plus community. This has huge ramifications for us because we know that this administration has been trying to take transgender people specifically, but the LGBTQ community in general, out of the realm of protections. The leaked memo that we all remember from a year ago where they want to change the definition of sex so that trans folks wouldn't have any recourse under the law, the protests that ensued after that, the new directive from HHS and from HUD where they want to discriminate against us in housing and in health care. So this is really huge, not just for the LGBTQ plus community, but for also any worker who might not conform to someone else's idea of how they should express their gender.
So you did something very unusual at the Emmys. Your guest, your plus one, was one Chase Strangio. Yes. And I wanted to go to, describe the scene and why you decided to do this.
Well, I noticed that not a lot of people were talking about this case. I think it's the most consequential civil rights case for LGBTQ rights in my lifetime. No one was really talking about it except Chase and a few other people. And I thought, what can I do? And so I was nominated for my 3rd Emmy this year and was going to be going to the Emmys. And I knew that would be a platform where a lot of people would be paying attention. And so I was like, well, we should take Chase and we should talk about this case on the red carpet. My stylist got the idea of making a clutch that said Title VII, October 8th, Supreme Court. Edie Parker designed it, and we went with a mission.
And we're showing the images of that. Let's hear Chase on the red carpet with Laverne Cox.
October 8th, everyone should be aware that the administration is asking the Supreme Court to make it legal to fire workers just because they're LGBTQ. And this is actually going to transform the lives of LGBTQ people and people who are not LGBTQ, anyone who departs from sex stereotypes, like all the fabulous people here, for example. So we really need to show up October 8th and pay attention because our lives are really on the line.
So that's Chase Strangio of the ACLU, the +1 with Laverne Cox at the Emmys. Again, as I said earlier, Laverne is the first openly trans actress to be nominated for a Primetime Emmy in any acting category. So you use that moment where the world was watching. That was an interview on Chase. Describe further the significance of this case and the Trump administration's stance. How has it changed?
Yeah, so as Laverne said, tomorrow the Supreme Court is going to be hearing arguments in these 3 cases that will absolutely transform the legal landscape for LGBTQ people, and not just LGBTQ people, but all women in particular, but anyone who departs from sex stereotypes. And what is really astounding, particularly in Amy Stevens' case, is that the case was filed in 2014 by the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That is the agency that enforces Title VII. And that agency brought the case arguing that when Amy was fired, it violated Title VII. And so the case is actually the EEOC versus Harris Funeral Homes, the employer that fired Amy just because she is transgender. And so it went up through the courts in that posture. After the election, the presidential election of 2016, the ACLU intervened on behalf of Amy because we were concerned that the agency and the administration would no longer defend the rights of trans people under federal law. And for good reason, because now we are before the Supreme Court and the Trump administration has changed sides. The United States is siding with the employers, urging the Supreme Court to make a rule for everyone that it is lawful to fire someone just because they are LGBTQ. And I want people to understand that the arguments they are advancing are so incredibly, staggeringly conservative and dangerous, because what they are saying is that we want a world under Title VII that goes all the way back to at least pre-1989 in the landmark case of Price Waterhouse, that allows employers to enforce sex stereotypes as long as they do so against men and women. And so what I mean by that is the Trump administration and the Alliance Defending Freedom, who is representing Amy's employer, really do want a world where a woman could be fired for not being feminine enough as long as they would fire a man for not being masculine enough. So imagine you go to work and you're a father, and you say, I need to leave at 5 to care for my kids. And they fire you because they say, no, men are supposed to be working and women are supposed to be the primary caretakers of children. That is the world they want. And so this is really a radical transformation of sex discrimination law that they're asking for.
I want to go back to Amy Stevens, the woman behind the first transgender civil rights case to go before the Supreme Court. Speaking at an ACLU news conference last week, she explained her decision to come out as a transgender woman.
I've been living basically 2 lives. One at home and in public, and one at work. And in the beginning, that wasn't so bad. But as time goes on and as time progressed, I got to the point that living 2 lives, being 2 people, was becoming downright impossible. And I knew that I couldn't keep going that way. And things came to a head in November of 2012 when I stood in the backyard with a gun to my chest, pondering the question, if I can't go forward and I can't go backwards, where does that leave me? And if this is all I have to look forward to, then what's the point of continuing? And in that hour, going over that and over that in my mind, I chose life. And I realized that I liked me too much to just disappear and go away.
So that's Amy Stevens, the woman behind the first transgender civil rights case to go before the Supreme Court. Talk about the journey Amy Stevens' case took through the courts until now.
So Amy Stevens' case was filed in federal court. She won in the lower court, so the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in her favor, as the majority of federal courts have for trans litigants. It has actually been the law, for 2 decades in many circuits of the federal judiciary that firing someone or discriminating against someone because they are transgender is per se sex discrimination under the law, as well as a prohibition on as well as a violation of the prohibition on sex stereotypes. So Amy won below. This was, the court said, no, you cannot fire someone just because they are transgender. And then it was the employer and the United States that are now before the Supreme Court arguing for a rule that it is, in fact, lawful to fire someone for being transgender. And we represent Amy. I think something that's incredibly poignant about Amy's remarks and that the letter she sent her employer is that she was going to be the same person, the same valued employee, and she was living this deeply painful lie, and she needed to be who she was. We only get one chance to live our lives as who we are, and so she was going to be an even better worker because she wasn't going to have to hide this core truth of herself, and she has the courage. She comes out, and then she gets fired and has spent the last 6 years fighting the termination while she faces no job, lost her health care. Her health is in decline because this is what happens when you lose your livelihood. And so hopefully we can appeal to the court on the simple proposition that Congress wrote a broad law that prohibits sex discrimination, and it covers trans people, as most lower courts have held.
We're going to break and then come back to talk about the issue of violence against trans people and how you think that this links. We are speaking with Chase Strangio, Deputy Director for Transgender Justice with the ACLU's LBGT and HIV Project, and actress Laverne Cox. Stay with us.
There's an outcast in everybody's life, and I am her. There's a shadow in everybody's front door, and I am her. There's a dark cloud in everybody's sunlight, and I am her. And cold, at least that's what I've been told. I got so many issues and problems that I go through. Sometimes I can't sleep at night. If I hide my face, heaven will be, it wouldn't be the worst thing that I ever did. It's a hell of a world that we're living in. James 2:10, a sin is a sin.
I Am Here by Shia Diamond. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guests are actress Laverne Cox and the ACLU's Chase Strangio. I want to ask about the violence against trans women. Last month, Jaliyah Jamar, an African-American trans woman, was murdered in Kansas City, Kansas. She's at least the 19th transgender person to be murdered in the U.S. this year. 13 died from gun violence. The majority are women of color. Jamar's killing followed the murder of 32-year-old Brooklyn Lindsay in Kansas City, Missouri in June. This comes after an assault in Portland, Oregon, of a transgender woman named Atlas Marshall. Marshall was attacked by a man shouting homophobic and transphobic slurs, leaving her with bruises on her head and knees. Laverne Cox, you've long spoken out on this issue. Talk about the climate in this country today.
It is really hard for me to continue to talk about the murders of trans women of color. I was talking to my makeup artist, Deja, who's also openly trans, early yesterday, and I told her, and when I started transitioning medically in 1998, that violence, that this was a reality in my life in 1998, that there were trans people being murdered all around me, and this insane fear, will I be next? I remember going to a memorial for Amanda Milan, a trans woman who was murdered in the early 2000s here in New York City. She was stabbed outside of the Port Authority. And for my entire life as a trans woman, for 21 years, I have been hearing about, witnessing, going to memorials, going to Trans Days of Remembrance, and the trauma of that is, I don't actually even have words for the trauma of that. And I think about just black people in general who have watched our people be murdered in the streets and the collective trauma of that. And I disassociate it from it so much because it's too much. It is way too much. And we live in a culture that consistently stigmatizes trans people, tell us that we aren't who we say we are. When I read the Alliance Defending Families brief on this Amy Stevens case, they bent over backwards to not use female pronouns to refer to Amy Stevens. There is this insistence in misgendering her. And what underlines most of the discrimination against trans people is the insistence that we are always and only the gender we were assigned at birth, that we're somehow fraudulent. And when we have an administration, when we have government policies that continually stigmatize us, it makes it okay for the person on the street who sees a trans person and decides that we should not exist anymore. And it is just, I'm really at a loss because I know it's intersectional. I know that it's about employment. I know it's about health care. I know it's about homelessness and having access to all of these things to keep us out of harm's way that so many of us don't have access to. The unemployment rate in the trans community is 3 times the national average, 4 times that for trans people of color. The majority of us make less than $10,000 a year. And so when you cannot make a living, you find yourself in street economies. You find yourself homeless. That makes you more of a target of violence. And so there's so many things that we have to do as a culture to end this violence. And showing up tomorrow at the Supreme Court, letting your friends and family know that it is not okay to discriminate against trans people, that when we are living our lives, so many times just walking down the street as a black trans woman, people saw it as some sort of affront to them when men would find themselves attracted to me because I was walking down the street, and they would get upset about that. I talked a lot about Alon Nettles' case, and she was just walking down the street, a black trans woman in 2013, and 2 men catcalled her, realized she was trans, and beat her until she died. We should not be killed simply for being who we are. We deserve civil rights. We deserve to be able to work and to live and to thrive. And so the targeting that this administration has done, one of the very first things that Jeff Sessions did in his Justice Department in February 2017, was rescind the guidelines that the Obama administration set forth for transgender children in the United States of America. And then the military ban happened, and then so many of these other things. And that consistently sends a message that it is okay to discriminate against us. I think part of this is the backlash against the unprecedented visibility we have in the media now. Trans people are coming forward and saying, this is who I am. I have a right to exist. We've always existed, and now we're coming out of the shadows. And as we come out of the shadows, people want to force us back into the dark, into back pages. And we're saying, no, we deserve a right to live in the light. And that's all we want.
Laverne, you starred in Orange is the New Black as the...
I was a castmate as part of an ensemble.
All stars. All stars. And it's now the last season has come out.
Yes.
Talk about the importance of the depiction of trans people played by trans people. You are in Dear White People now. You are in Black Lady's sketch show. Can You Keep a Secret is your latest. Talk about the importance of being front and center with who you are.
Well, we have to change the narrative. According to GLAAD, 84% of Americans don't personally know someone who's transgender. So what we learn about transgender people, we learn in the media. So how we're represented in the media is crucially important to our life chances. what was amazing about Orange is the New Black is when we started in 2013, there were no openly trans people with recurring roles on television. And now, according to GLAAD, there's 26 of trans folks who are openly trans working in television now, which is remarkable. I think we need more. I think we need more stories. And I think with this unprecedented visibility, again, there's a backlash against our existence. But I think if we can continue to tell stories and continue to have artists come forward, casting directors, producers, and tell our stories courageously. I think what's exceptional about those 3 projects that you listed that I'm involved in, Dear White People, Black Lady Sketch Show, the film Can You Keep a Secret, that's on demand right now. Is that I'm not
that's
playing...
on Apple.
It's on Apple, but it's on all platforms right now. I'm not playing trans characters in any of those. I'm an openly trans actress, and I'm not playing trans characters. And that feels remarkable, and it feels like this insane progress, right? So we have this, in some ways the best of times and the worst of times, where I get to sort of thrive as an openly trans Black woman, which is unheard of, really. We couldn't have even imagined this 10 years ago. But at that same time, we have these insane murders that keep happening in record numbers. We see these policies. So it's this holding space for both these realities is really, it's really intense, and it's really, I think it's important to celebrate wins and victories, but it's also important to understand that just because there are trans people on billboards and on magazine covers, that they're not trying to take our rights away. And there's been a concerted effort. Trans people have been deeply scapegoated by conservatives for many years. I think since marriage equality became the law of the land, I think a lot of people may be upset about that. And as trans people become more visible, people are becoming upset by that. And so they're like, we have to target this group of people. And it doesn't, and as Chase said earlier, it doesn't just have implications for trans people in the LGBTQ plus community. It has implications for everyone. Because when you discriminate against trans people, it makes it okay to discriminate against everybody else. That Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins decision from 1989, I think it was, said that a woman at Price Waterhouse was denied a promotion because her employers thought she was too masculine. Her case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that enforcing sex stereotypes is indeed sex discrimination. What the the Violence Defending Family and this administration is arguing that it is okay to enforce those sex stereotypes. So if we lose this, then it'll be okay for them to say you're not the right kind of woman or you're not the right kind of man, even if you're not transgender or LGBTQ+. And that is not the kind of America I want to live in. It's not the kind of country that any of us should be living in.
I wanted to go to the protests that were taking place on Sunday outside the Supreme Court. Women's rights activists calling for Justice Brett Kavanaugh's removal from the bench 1 year after Republican senators narrowly confirmed him to the U.S. Supreme Court, despite multiple credible accusations of attempted rape and sexual assault. Massachusetts Congressmember Ayanna Pressley introduced a resolution last month to impeach Justice Kavanaugh. She told the crowd she believed Kavanaugh's accusers and Anita Hill, who told Congress in 1991 that Justice Clarence Thomas sexually harassed her.
When we share our stories, our pain, and our struggles, we liberate each other. Together, we will raise our voices to mobilize our communities and to legislate our destiny. I believe in the power of us. And our fighting didn't end when Brett Michael Kavanaugh put on a robe. And our fighting won't end until there is a real investigation and justice for survivors. I still believe Anita Hill. I still believe Dr. Christine Ford. And I believe Deborah Ramirez.
So that's Massachusetts Congressmember Ayanna Pressley. Chase Strangeview, if you could summarize Brett Kavanaugh's career in this last year, his judicial record on the Supreme Court, and respond to the call for his impeachment.
So the last term was his first, term on the bench. This is his first full term on the bench. I think what strikes me as most important in this moment is that It's a reminder of the power that these 9 human beings hold over our lives. And he will be hearing a case tomorrow that is directly about sex discrimination in the workplace, including, I might note, sexual harassment in the workplace, sexual violence in the workplace. So he has the power, along with his 8 colleagues, to really decide what the law is going to permit, what it is going to require, and how we as human beings in this country are either going to be protected or cast aside. And so whether or not he is impeached, whether or not we can look back on Clarence Thomas and all of the accusations against these individuals, I think what we need to do now is look at the power they hold in our lives today and say we have to mass mobilize to ensure that the decisions that they make about whether we live or die are ones that we are going to hold them accountable to. Because at the end of the day, the court will decide things, but it is us in the streets, it is movements, it is changing hearts and minds and building power that is ultimately going to transform the country that we live in. And so, yes, we want to hold people to account, but we also have agency in the movements that we build inside the court and outside the court. And so I will be looking Brett Kavanaugh in the eye tomorrow as a trans person in this case. But I also want everyone to know that they have the power to say that whatever happens at the court, that we are going to keep demanding that we be seen and that we get to live in the light, as Laverne said.
Laverne Cox, are you going to be there tomorrow?
I will be there tomorrow, yes. It's
All
my
right.
first time going to the Supreme Court.
Can you directly address President Trump and Vice President Pence, your message, what you feel they need to hear right now?
I'm not really sure it's about our president and vice president right now. I think it's about the people. I think it's about the folks out there who maybe voted for them or didn't vote for them, and the people who didn't vote. And I think it's about everybody out there who really we do have the power as the people. And I think sometimes we feel powerless and we feel like there's not something that we can do. And so I would say to everyone out there that you do have the power to make a change in your lives and in our government. But you have to lift your voice. You have to vote. You have to talk to the people in your lives, because I think it's a hearts and minds conversation as well as it's a policy conversation. So I don't have anything to say to them. I wish
the action tomorrow outside, can you describe what it's going to be?
I think Chase can do that better than I can.
Yeah, so tomorrow there's going to be multiple actions. There's going to be civil disobedience action. There's going to be rallies on our side. We are bringing people together because as much as there will be a legal decision decided in the court, what the country will see is what happens outside. And so there will be people from all over this country rallying in defense of LGBTQ lives and to protect the hard-fought protections under the Civil Rights Act that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was instrumental in implementing through the courts, and that so many people have lived and died for. And so people will be showing up in the rain in D.C. tomorrow, and it is going to be a beautiful moment that we will never forget.
Finally, talking about trying to change culture, Laverne, you fought to change the IMDb, the Internet Movie Database's birth name policy, which it recently revised. Talk about the fight.
I know that fight continues. There's been some progress made there. I think the biggest piece is that for a very, very long time, as I said earlier, trans folks have always existed, but we existed in the shadows. And so a lot of the structural things that exist in our culture now, the systems that are in place, have not been in place to accommodate trans people. And so now that we're acknowledging that trans people exist, systemically, some changes have to be made. And that's really what that was about. And we have to make a lot of other systemic changes so that we can fully acknowledge the humanity of not just trans people, but people of color and immigrants and people with disabilities. And no matter how you identify in terms of your gender identity or sexual orientation.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Laverne Cox, transgender actress and activist, best known for her role on the show Orange is the New Black, played Sophia Bursett, a transgender woman in prison for using credit card fraud to finance her transition. Chase Strangeview, Deputy Director for Transgender Justice with the ACLU's LGBT and HIV Project. We'll continue, of course, to follow this case and what happens in the streets tomorrow, as well as what happens in the Supreme Court. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, major surprise announcement about what will happen to U.S. troops and to Kurdish soldiers in Syria. And we'll look at the mass protests that have been taking place in Iraq. Over 100 people have been shot dead by police and security forces. Stay with us. Mild by Ida Nadim. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to the Middle East, where U.S. troops have begun withdrawing from northeast Syria as Turkey prepares to invade Kurdish-controlled areas of Syria. For years, the Kurds have been close allies with the United States in the fight against ISIS. On Sunday, the White House released a statement that surprised many in the region. It said, quote, "Today, President Donald J. Trump spoke with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey by telephone. Turkey will soon be moving forward with its long-planned operation in northern Syria. The United States Armed Forces will not support or be involved in that operation, and the United States forces, having defeated the ISIS territorial caliphate, will no longer be in the immediate area." The announcement marks a major shift in U.S. policy. In January, President Trump threatened to, quote, devastate Turkey economically if it attacked Kurdish forces in Syria. The U.S. has about 1,000 troops in northeastern Syria. It's not clear whether they'll pull back to allow Turkey's assault or leave Syria entirely. Meanwhile, in other news from the region, the mass anti-government protests are continuing in Iraq. The death toll has now topped 109 as police and soldiers continue to open fire on thousands of demonstrators who are defying government-imposed curfews. To talk about all these issues, we're joined by Patrick Coburn, Middle East correspondent for The Independent. He's joining us from London. Patrick, welcome back to Democracy Now! Let's start with the surprise announcement after the phone conversation between Erdogan and Trump that the U.S. is pulling back its troops for Turkey to attack in northern Syria. Explain what you understand is happening and the significance of this.
Well, this is really almost a Shakespearean act of betrayal. The Turkish army is planning to come across the border with Syria. This means that the Kurds who've been fighting ISIS, fighting Daesh, will mostly flee southwards. This is about 2 million people. So we're going to have what is in effect a major act of ethnic cleansing there. It's not clear from what the White House says how far the Turks will go. They say it's going to be on the border, but they also say the Turks are going to take over a refugee camp full of former ISIS members, particularly women and children, at a place called Al-Hol. But that's right over on the Iraqi border. If the Turks go that far, then they're taking over a big chunk of northeast Syria. So this is sort of good news for the Turks. It's very bad news for the Kurds, who lost 11,000 dead fighting ISIS. And for ISIS, it's very good news because it means that their main opponent, the Syrian Kurdish forces, are either going to be fighting the Kurds, the Turks, or are going to be running away or going to be dead. So this is the sort of news I think ISIS has been waiting for its opponents to split up. And it's pretty extraordinary, the statement says, we defeated ISIS on the ground. All the troops on the ground were led by the Kurds and some Arab allies, so there was U.S. air power. But the defeat was by the Kurds, who are not mentioned in this new agreement between Turkey and the U.S. So it really is an extraordinary act of treachery.
Tweeted this morning, it's time for us to get out of these ridiculous, endless wars, many of them tribal, and bring our soldiers home. We will fight where it is to our benefit and only fight to win. Turkey, Europe, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Russia, and the Kurds will now have to figure the situation out and what they want to do with the captured ISIS fighters in their neighborhood. They all hate ISIS, have been enemies for years. We are 7,000 miles away and will crush ISIS again if they come anywhere near us! ! So if you could respond further to that, Patrick Coburn. Again, it's not clear if Trump is saying he'll bring the U.S. troops home or just move them over for this Turkish onslaught.
Yeah, I mean, the significance of this may not be obvious to people who don't know that that part of northern Syria, that the Kurdish population generally lives just south of the frontier line between Turkey and Syria. So the Turkish army doesn't have to move very far south to take over all the Kurdish cities like Qamishli and Kobani and other places. So as soon as they move a little bit south, you have a massive exodus of Kurds in that area. The statement says that is an isolationist manifesto, in a way, saying we have nothing to do with this. But they might have told the Kurds beforehand. But as I said, it was the Kurds who actually fought and defeated ISIS since 2014. And Turkey, for quite a long part of that period, was allowing all these foreign fighters to cross the border from Turkey into Syria. A lot of these people who are now in this refugee camp at Al-Hol, how did they get into Syria? Well, they just crossed over the Turkish border without being impeded over that time because there was a sort of tolerant attitude on the part of Turkey towards ISIS. And Turkey made perfectly clear that if it preferred ISIS to win rather than the Kurds. We saw that at the siege of a Kurdish city called Kobani in 2014.
Earlier today, the United Nations warned against the Turkish invasion of northern Syria. Panos Mountzis is the UN regional humanitarian chief for the Syria crisis. This is what he said.
It's a conflict that has gone on for far too long, and therefore any operation that takes place at the moment has to take into account to ensure that we don't see any further displacement. We don't know what's going to happen. We are preparing for the worst because indeed, from experience, this could result to a displacement of people. We want to make sure that we are ready.
Patrick, that's the UN Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for the Syrian crisis. Your response?
Sure. Well, unfortunately, we know all too well what's likely to happen because the Turkish army already last year crossed the Syrian border into a Kurdish enclave called Afrin. It was almost entirely Kurdish populated, and drove out the Kurdish population. President Erdogan of Turkey announced halfway through that he discovered that the original population of this area, he didn't say when, was Arab, and they should be allowed back. So you had what was basically one of the very few peaceful parts of Syria suddenly devastated by war, and the Kurds driven out. And that seems to have been an early preview of what we're likely to see in the rest of northern Syria, which is the Turkish army crossing the border, the Kurds fleeing south. It's not clear where they'll go, and a resurgence of ISIS, but they'll no longer be fighting the Kurds. So I think we've got a very good idea what's going to happen. And unfortunately, this is happening at a moment when the war in Syria seemed to be ebbing. It was still going on in different parts of the country, but nothing like what we'd seen before. So it's suddenly been had a new life being injected into it by this decision by Trump.
You've just returned from Iraq. These mass protests have just begun. At this point, over 100 people, I think the number's 109, have been killed in these demonstrations by the security and police. Can you explain what took place? You were there when it started earlier this week.
Yeah, it was pretty extraordinary. I mean, I was there on Tuesday when it began, and I knew there was going to be a small sort of demonstration not far from where I was staying in central Baghdad in a place called Tahrir Square later that evening, but people weren't paying that amount of attention. There'd been weekly demonstrations there. The protesters tried to cross a bridge, which leads in the direction of the green zone, and suddenly the security forces on the bridge started throwing stun grenades, rubber bullets, and then live rounds. So they killed a lot of people, wounded a lot of people. That led to a big reaction the following day, many more protests, and then the government declared a curfew. Baghdad's a big city, 7 million people, and I was on the streets later pretty cautiously, and it was completely empty. They cut the internet, so the whole city was paralyzed. It hasn't stopped this going on. You said there are 109 dead, but there are also over 6,000 wounded, according to the Interior Ministry. And doctors I talked to in the hospitals think that the number of dead is a gross underestimate by the government, that the real figure is much higher.
Your recent piece, The Iraqi People Are in Revolt, Pushing the Post-Saddam Hussein Settlement to the Brink of Collapse. Explain what that is.
Well, in 2003, Saddam falls. Iraq is a major oil producer. It's produced about $6.5 billion worth of oil a month. But ordinary Iraqis find that such is the level of corruption in the government, the amount of money that's been stolen, that no new roads are being built, that schools and hospitals and power plants and everything else just are exactly the same as they were 16 years ago. So one of the demands of the protesters is against corruption. But it's corruption in a way that I think many people would have difficult to imagine, which, it's a kleptocracy. It means everything is stolen. A contract for a road is signed or a power station. At the end of them, all the money disappears. There's no road at the end of the day, no power station. So there's been mounting rage about that, and joblessness as well, just people unable to get jobs. I was driving through central Baghdad last week, and outside ministries, you'd see groups of guys trying to having little encampments protesting that they haven't been able to get jobs. And this is probably one of the reasons why these protests are going to go on. The protesters were saying to me, look, we don't have anything to lose. Here I am in my late 20s and 30s. I'd never had a job. I'll never get a job with this type of government that steals everything or distributes jobs only to its own members of its own political party. So you've had all these economic and social grievances building up and up, and then they exploded last week. And it's unlikely, I think, the government will get back to where we were before this happened. They're offering a 17-part plan at the moment to improve the economy, but nobody believes them. Because people say, the 17-part plan, the bit they don't mention is which they're firing at us, snipers are firing at us from buildings with live rounds, killing people. People arriving in the hospital, they've mostly been hit in the head or the heart. They're obviously shooting to kill. So I think that this is we are on the edge, we're on a new stage in Iraq in which we're heading towards mass uprisings, protests in the street, a government that's completely on the defensive, doesn't know what to do, but it's also very difficult to reform because it's so corrupt and the whole system of government is based on corruption.
And protests are also in Lebanon as well, is that right? I spoke to the Iraqi president, Barham Saleh, at the United Nations and asked him about pressure on his thoughts about the U.S. putting so much pressure on Iran. In the last 10 seconds we have, Trump ramping up that pressure on Iran. How does that affect Iraq?
It raises the political temperature. It means that all this is taking place, this sort of crisis which revolves around economic disaster.
Patrick Coburn, we're going to have to leave it there. I thank you so much, Middle East correspondent for The Independent.